Hey everyone, it's Rick, and thanks for joining me on another Inwyt Walkabout. I'm in Oslo, Norway this week, and happen to be in a park called the Vigeland Sculpture Park. I'll show you a picture of one of the larger sculptures in the background there. Enjoying still cold weather, but nice to have a change of scenery. I wanted to continue our conversation from last time where we were looking at memory as part of our thought process and how easy it is to misremember or to distort things that we've experienced or learned in a way that can be very convincing until we potentially have the opportunity to see that actually what we remember was really not correct. And I wanted to look and focus on another element of our use of accumulated knowledge and memory, and that is the fragmented nature of it and the gaps that show up when something misaligns with our structured view of who we are and how the world looks. And I'll take you back to high school days where I had just come back from 3 years of living in Africa with my family and was in a new school environment, a new friend environment, had to kind of start afresh, if you will. And I became really good friends with a guy who lived not too far away from me, and in the context of activities that we did around school, sports and such, we spent a lot of time together and became very close. And at some point, I think it was the end of my sophomore year, beginning of my junior year, my friend's mom got remarried, and in order to merge the new families, they decided to move out of state. And, all of a sudden here I was facing, the loss of a really good friend and, not having much of a replacement plan or opportunity that, could be thought of far in advance. And so when he left, all of a sudden I had this very uncomfortable gap in my life and in my daily routine where this initial feeling of urgency to fill the gap and to not really like what I saw behind it, which was a whole lot of nothing, emptiness, loneliness, and again, sort of this feeling of pressure to plug that hole and to think, what other pieces, what other elements of my life could I use to either replace it or to expand or to focus on, to get distracted by. And there was a part of me that was, while I was doing that, was also, in the backdrop saying, don't just let things play out, just see what happens. Don't force your hand, just roll with it. And sure enough, I kind of followed that inner advice, if you will, that inner voice, and before long, things worked themselves out. I of course had other friends, and I think I started to realize that this relationship that I had or that I still had, even though he was out of state now, really was not the anchor to my well-being, and that there was much more to life and to the joy of living than having one friend that all of a sudden was gone and now it was over. So what's the point of this? Well, I think for one, again, it's a great example for me on reflection as to how dependent we are on the relationships that we build. That, we want relationships, of course, and life is relationship with people and everything around us. But, I think the thing to consider is how relationships can really be, again, distorting in the sense that if there's a dependence on them and an attachment to them, it becomes much more a relationship of trying to establish security and having expectations, and really one of taking more than it is of sharing. And we can get trapped in this thought box again, where again, running through that really quick, something changes, you lose a friend, and immediately you identify that as a loss. You feel that, you interpret that saying, this is a great friend, I'm never going to be able to replace this friend, what am I going to do? And the what should be shows up as I've got to fill this gap. And then you come up with all sorts of ideas, you imagine scenarios of what you have to do, and typically you have sort of a reactive response. And it's all, again, based on this setup of, these elements of self-image and accumulated knowledge and experiences that are driving this circular motion that kind of creates this feeling of panic. And, perhaps when you start to look at, the function of that, and also, the gap that is actually there, and you can actually just take a look at, what that emptiness is. Initially, that gets interpreted by us as loneliness, as, something that has a void, something that's missing. However, when you kind of think about it, or maybe not think about it, but just watch it and really turn off that element of accumulated knowledge, is just stop thinking for a second. What you may start to see is that gap, that emptiness, is really not something to be afraid of and to look at as a source of insecurity, but really shows up as something that shifts loneliness to comfort in being alone. And there is a distinction, I think, between loneliness and aloneness, where loneliness is the result of perceived gaps, where what's behind sort of this wall of ideas and this wall of imagination and self-image is actually something that is very whole and really independent in the sense that it doesn't rely on anything around you in your daily life to be in play. And so, when you're in that space, then all of a sudden your relationships change, and it no longer becomes relationship for the sake of security or for the sake of taking. It becomes much more of a relationship of sharing, of inquiry, and of collaboration. And again, in the context of conflict, the what should be and what needs to be really starts to dissipate. And in the context of problem solving, you're not clinging to things that you think are imperative for your well-being, in the sense of these fragments that we've all kind of learned as being essential, and all of a sudden they're not so essential, and you can actually look at what's actually happening. And so it doesn't mean that you just show up and accept whatever's going on, But again, you look at things not from the vantage point of your particular perspective and interpretation. You look at it in a much more holistic sense. And when things shift, which they always do, you're part of that shift. And you can just kind of roll with it and, respond correctly because you actually see what's going on. So think about that in your daily lives, when you're with your friends or you're, in relationships, particularly where, again, there are rough spots. Those are the moments where you have opportunity to kind of take a look at what's going on in your thought process and also what's going on behind thought, just kind of watching, saying, what am I actually concerned about here behind, what is front and center. And you may see something different. So that's it for today. Next time, we'll continue to explore the different elements that play into how we look at things through our use of thought and otherwise, and we'll go from there. So I'll leave you with one more view here of the park. Let's see if I can flip this. Have a great day, a great week, and I look forward to next time. This is Rick with Inwyt Walkabout. Take care.